So welcome everyone to a Gadsden Arts Center Museum Art Talk Live. This one is with artist Terrie Corbett. We're very excited to have this talk with Terrie. I've known Terrie since about the first week I came to Gadsden Arts. Terrie, you curated my first ever exhibition here called Kiln Joy, which was all forms of translucent and kiln-fired art. And it's just been a pleasure to know you these 17 years. And to see your work. Absolutely.
Thank you, Grace.
And I'd like to thank our sponsors for Terrie's exhibition and this current group of exhibitions we have on view. Major exhibitions like Masters of American Photography are made possible by the Impact Fund. That is a special donor-supported fund that lets us borrow important collections from other museums and bring them to our region for everyone's benefit. And it's a lot of fun to be able to do that. Our title sponsor for this group of exhibitions is True Leaf. They are sponsored in memory of Mary Middleton Suber and Rebecca Rutan Shaw. And we are sponsored in part by Black Fig, the City of Quincy, the Gadsden Tourist Development Council, and Reading Public Museum. We also have a special Mary Proctor exhibition up called I Am Just the Messenger, and that is made possible by the Institute of Museums and Library Services and the National Endowment for the Arts. And everything we do is supported in part by the State of Florida Division of Arts and Culture. So we appreciate all of those funders.
Right. I will get started here. I'd love to introduce Terrie Corbett and her exhibition Beyond the Familiar that we have on display in the Munroe Family Community Gallery. Terrie trained as a painter actually at Sam Houston State University, and she has lived in Tallahassee with her husband and fellow artist Chuck since the early 1980s. For over 40 years, she's exhibited her work in over 150 exhibitions and won over dozens of awards for her creations. Her work is found in several public and private permanent collections, including FSU Museum of Fine Arts and the Florida Department of State. And in addition to exhibiting, since 2000, Terrie has curated several exhibitions for regional art centers in the area, and she served on many boards and committees for local arts organizations. She's very much contributes to her community. So now with this exhibition, Terrie really hopes to take the view beyond the familiar with her expressive and abstract compositions. She's an intuitive painter, and her art offers viewers the opportunity to explore up close the symphony of colors and unique textures produced by her skillful knowledge, working with paint produced with hot and cold wax. So this exhibition, you can see kind of a panorama of the gallery here on the slide. And most of this work is created encaustic, so wax and paint, but Terrie, you also created fused glass paintings and also drawings in graphite and charcoal very prolifically. So did the encaustic come later, or have you always painted with wax?
Well, the encaustic didn't come around. I was interested in encaustic when I first met Nancy Gunn in the 1980s, but I didn't start painting in encaustic until about 2016, 2017. I had been interested in it because, of course, I studied it in art school, but I became aware of Nancy's work, hadn't met her, and wanted to meet her. So I went to one of the museums. It was the FSU Museum of Fine Arts, where she had her work on display, and some of the rest of us had work on display as well. So I walked up, I saw her against the wall. So her back was to me, and I thought, well, I'm going to go introduce myself and let her know how I admire her, how she's an inspiration to me. And as I said, this was in the mid-'80s. So I walked up to her, and just as I got up to her, she was talking to the person beside her and pointing to the wall. And she goes, "Now this is a really nice drawing." Well, lo and behold, it was my drawing. And it kind of took my breath away, actually. And this is the drawing. So I thought, well, that's good enough for tonight. And I backed away without introducing myself and without meeting her. So fast forward 15 years later, Sam Flieger, who was curator at Lemoyne for many years, knew of my admiration for her because we do have 6 of her paintings. And he knew about the story, so he wanted to introduce me to her, and he did. And we shared a laugh about that. And she was a lovely person, just everything that I had hoped for in an inspirational person who does wonderful art. And at that meeting, we agreed that I would read to her because her eyesight was failing. So unfortunately, she passed away, and the end of our relationship was there. But several years later, probably in 2015, one of her dear friends, who is a retired faculty member at FSU, invited me over to her home, and she gave me all of Nancy's supplies, pigments, encaustic, brushes, and even a frying pan that had the last mixture of medium that she had made. So I tell you that it's on display in my studio. Not the neatest studio, but I do have Nancy represented greatly in the studio, and she is an inspiration every day. You also mentioned that I worked in kiln-fired glass for several years, 15 years to be exact. And well, I did a lot of copper on enamel for about 5 years too. But these pieces reflect the paintings. I did some functional pieces, but these reflect the paintings that were wall pieces. And I did a lot of sandblast etching, and I also worked in powdered glass. The piece in the middle that you're looking at, I mentioned this to Angie the other day. This actually won a 3rd place award in an international glass competition. So I was real pleased with that.
Absolutely.
So,
the powder glass, which
yes, this is powdered glass. And I was also telling Angie how I put the glass powder, I sifted out on a light board and move it around with skewers, with brushes, whatever. And then I take the clear piece of glass that it's laid on, I lift it up off the light board, lay that clear piece of glass on a piece of white glass, and then put it in the kiln and fire it for about 24 hours. So those are glass powder drawings. And I think that you can see the relationship to the graphite drawings as well.
Absolutely. And so besides just the mediums, oh, hold on, am I still here?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my screen just went away and I don't know where you all went. My screen just, y'all can still see my screen? Okay, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, you can see.
Okay, so your mediums progress, but do you think also, would you say that your art in terms of subject matter and whatnot has changed? See, there we go.
Yes, it has. It's progressed from a more linear approach like these drawings to a direction of color and movement. Early on, I was painting landscapes, cats, the figure, still lives. However, I gradually started abstracting the work, and it slowly became non-representational, then finally non-objective. But I still do a lot of these works in graphite. I don't sell many. I've sold 2 in my life because they're so tedious and take so long to do. I'm a little bit selfish with them, but the Dean of Fine Arts bought one of them, and the chairman of the art reference books in the library bought the other one. So I thought those were pretty good sales. But anyway, I still do work on them a lot. It's a real Zen practice for me. And let me say that these works are on a high surface Bristol. Even though you see soft edges, sometimes harder edges, but the softness of that is line after line after line after line. I do not use a smudge stick. I do not use the side of the pencil. It's just one line over another line. It's cross hatching in the extreme, really. And the more you do that, the softer the edges get.
That's such an interesting way. Had you not told me that, I would not have known. And, that's just an interesting way, that your process. So speaking of processes, a lot of us are curious and are not as familiar with encaustic. So you have so nicely made a video for us to watch of kind of the process of making encaustics. Creating an encaustic work of art. And I will preface this by saying there's a lot of safety concerns with working with hot wax. So you are going to try this yourself at home. Make sure you're in a ventilated area, wear gloves, don't get the wax on you. So be very prepared and have fans and It can be very toxic. We won't hear a fan going for Terrie because she turned it off to make the video, but normally she has a loud fan going.
Right.
And you're working on cradle boards, correct?
I'm working on cradle boards that my husband makes. You can't really work on canvas with encaustic or even with cold wax because the flex will eventually, any kind of flex will eventually crack the wax, even the flex of framing the piece, no matter how stable it looks. You should always work on wood. Birch panels are the best, but Charlie makes all my cradle boards, the large ones, the small ones. I don't give him enough credit, but believe me, I couldn't do it without him.
He does a lot. So I'm going to play this. It's up all the way on my computer, but if it's sounding a little bit low on yours, be sure to turn up your volume, but hopefully you all can hear everything. Okay.
Some of the supplies that we'll use, this is called a cradle board. My husband Chuck makes most of these cradle boards. You can see they can be anywhere from 3/4 of an inch thick to 1 inch thick to 2 to 3 inches thick. But say it looks like a cradle board. The front has encaustic gesso on it. This is a torque. This is what I use to do most of my work. You can also use a heat gun. However, because of the blowing, you can use. Uh-oh, the volume went away, Angie. It's more hands-on. Oh, there it goes. Okay. I would prefer to use this. All right. This is the cradle board. This is the encaustic medium with pigments in it. And this is clear encaustic medium. And the first thing that we do, I'll move these out of the way. The first thing that we do is take the cradle board and coat it with encaustic medium. Dries pretty quickly. Now, theoretically, realistically, you should fuse after each coat, but I've done this so many times that I usually put a couple of coats on before I start fusing. You can adjust the flame to a long flame, or you can bring it to a shorter flame. Harder, softer. For our purposes here, I'm using a little bit longer flame, a little bit softer. I don't know if you can tell, but when this starts being fused, it gets very shiny. Just like when it starts cooling off, it gets very matte. And that is one thing, that one of the main differences in an encaustic painting and oil painting. A lot of oil paintings, unless you use cold wax, are very shiny, especially when you put the varnish on. Encaustic has a very matte surface. And I'm going to let this cool a little bit. And I'm going to apply a couple more coats of medium. And you see I've got something in there. I was doing some experimentation. That happens to be pine needle. So if that happens, get one of your skewers or some tool that you might have and just lift it out. I'm going to fuse again. Be careful and not leave the heat gun in any one place too long. You probably shouldn't shake it as much as I've been shaking it. If you point it in one direction for too long, you will go all the way back down to your substrate, which is not what we want. We want to have several layers to protect on top of here. I don't know if you can see, but I've missed a little spot right here. So I'm going to fill that in. Okay. Now then, I may not have mentioned this, but this is a Paula Roland Hot Box that I do some of my monoprints on. It heats very evenly. I usually take the encaustic and draw on it, take paper and lift off what I've drawn. Sometimes I add ink to them, sometimes I don't. This is the clear medium, as I said. This is my palette. I can mix things on here, like take this and go like this. See that? and it'll stay that way. And over here are the pigmented encaustic paint. I think what I'll do now is take one of these. That's not melted. That's almost melted. Ah, this is melted pretty good. And I'm just going to do some strips like this. I'm not really creating a painting right now. I'm doing this for demonstration purposes. Let that cool for just a minute, and then if you keep heating this too much, it takes longer and longer for it to get dry. I know you saw me shaking this a while ago, but nice even strokes, best way to go. Drying as we speak. Some of this. Oh, boy. I had some red in that, so now we have kind of a rust color. We combined an orangish yellow, a greenish yellow and a reddish brown. So we'll just go ahead and go with that. Now I'm going to take some of this, mix it with a little bit of this white, and go here, 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 and here, and here. This is fun to play with, folks. Slowly back and forth. You may notice that I have the sides taped. After my husband creates the panels, I put tape around them so that I can put encaustic gesso on there and so that I can eventually paint, because the wax will run over. You don't really want that on the sides of the painting. Some people do. Some people actually want it on the side of the painting. I prefer not to have it on there. So then we can paint sides or put strip framing on it or whatever we decide to do without being dedicated to one particular option. Now, then, as you can see, as I said, the reason they call this painting with fire is because you can move this paint all around. You can move it any direction you want. Let's go with another color here. And then let it. I'm using so quickly here for demonstration purposes. It's not drying as quickly as it normally does, but it's still drying faster than anything else you might use to paint with. I could stroke this, but let's see if I can do it. Well, you see what I did is I messed up some of the paint because it's still hot. But like I said, my first demonstration was about 12 minutes long, so I'm trying to speed this one up a little bit. Okay.
All right.
Some of the supplies that we'll use, this is called a cradle board.
Hold
My
on.
husband
So
Chuck
sorry.
makes
Hold on.
most of,
Goodness. Wanted to show you guys the finished product here from that demonstration, which is pretty interesting. I know you just don't really quite understand how the different layers come together. And so thank you for making that, Terrie. I appreciate it.
oh, sure.
And one thing you had said, you told me earlier, is that you had to put the encaustic gesso down first because that helps keep it on the substrate and makes it last longer, right?
Mhm. Yeah, you don't want any plastic mixed with encaustic, so you can't use regular gesso. Even though I suspect the encaustic gesso, which is developed by the R&F company, which is it's a big maker of encaustic supplies. I'm sure it does have some acrylic in it, some plastic in it, but not nearly as much as just regular gesso. So it's a little more expensive, but I always buy the encaustic gesso just to make sure.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Okay, so
Angie, can I interrupt you for just a
Yeah,
minute?
please.
I went by without saying thank you to Grace and thank you to you for hosting this show and for doing this Zoom. But one thing I wanted to mention is to the people that are here, I've told you this several times, but I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the fact that you embraced the title Beyond the Familiar and hung the show in a very creative way. So thank you for doing that.
Oh, it was a pleasure. We really enjoyed it. And it was just so interesting to see how it could, fill the space and, really transform the gallery. It was really an exciting installation. So we're thrilled. And thanks for bringing us some great work. Now, you mentioned you follow your intuition when making art. So does any pre-planning or thought go into it, or is it purely improvisational?
Well, I do work intuitively, but I make decisions about my color palette. I'm inspired by nature and music or by the work of another artist. I have a piece in there, a series called the Barber Series, which was inspired by the artist and sculptress Barbara Balser. One of her pieces that actually was on display there at Gadsden, I took the color, it's more neutral than I usually work, but I was so inspired by the color in the bodice on one of her figures that I just had to paint. And I wasn't done with one, wasn't done with two, and finally did all three of them. So I really appreciate that kind of inspiration. And we're all inspired by each other as artists, I'm sure. But that was one of the wonderful things that came about from doing this show, is looking for those inspirations that'll lead you forward. And I think this one really did.
Absolutely. And you can see that palette is a little bit different than, say, some of your other pieces that might be a little bit quieter. They're always colorful, but.
Well, this one, for instance, I told you that the name of this is in a series that I've done, a whole series of paintings called All My Cats Purr Like This. And this is number 4, I guess. Mm-hmm. But there's a certain sound that cats make when they're purring. There's a certain rhythm. There's a certain soothing sound. And one of my older cats, he's my senior cat, he was sleeping there one night, and just his little sounds, his little interruptions in his purring, it inspired me to do this piece. I know that sounds probably a little too sensitive, but it's another in the series, All My Cats Purr Like This.
We get inspiration from everywhere, right?
We do. Mm-hmm.
Now, you can see the ones and some of these others are a little bit bolder, but how do you decide which colors to use? Is there specific meanings to them, to the colors?
Well, I have specific colors that I like. I tend to go toward quinacridone magenta, perylene red, phthalo blue, cadmiums, any of the aquas. I tend to go toward those, and I use a lot of Naples yellow too. So it's not so much a specific meaning, it's just that I use the color that I like. And because sometimes when your painting gets out of hand and it's out of hand and you want to try to bring it back together, you can use a transparent paint to organize it and make sure that it falls back in place. And by covering part of it, or by sometimes covering the whole painting, it comes into view what needs to be done. So I use a lot of transparents, and of course I use a lot of opaques too, and try to find the balance between the transparent paint and an opaque paint in my work.
Now you can see an example of it here, sgraffito. Can you explain to our audience what that term is and how do you use it in your works?
Okay, sgraffito literally means to delve into the surface of the painting. The painting on the left, for instance, I used a tool called a needle skewer, and it is something that ceramic artists use, and you can see it really cuts down into there, and it helps you see the journey of the painting as well. You know, there's a history in the painting, and sometimes when you cut into it, you're able to see that history come through, because none of my paintings, none of them have any less than about 10 or 15 layers on them. Usually it rounds out about 8 layers on each painting. The painting on the right was done with the encaustic painting on the right, the tool used was a nail, because there's about 10 layers of encaustic on that painting. So I had to have a nail to gouge way down into it. And the scary thing about doing this in encaustic is once you gouge down into it, you have to paint it with black oil paint. So there's that moment when you think, I've ruined it, it's gone. But I get a little coconut oil and go over it and keep pulling it off until only the thin lines show. And of course, what's happened is the oil paint has seeped into those lines. Then the next scary part, after you do that, you have to fuse it one more time so that the wax will seal. What happens sometimes if you're not careful, that black oil paint starts seeping out. So then you have to get a razor blade and scrape it off. That makes a little mark, so you have to fuse it again. So you can get real in the bushes and weeds on this particular process. Yeah. But I think this one turned out okay.
Absolutely, yeah. They have a definitely marked difference with those kind of strong black lines. So do you have any sort of kind of messages or ideas that you're wishing to convey in your art?
Well, I guess my main message is to try to let go of the preconceptions you may have. You have an opportunity. I have an opportunity when I'm looking at work to see the way that the artists, the way that they see the world. So I try to let go of my preconceptions and enjoy the movement, the texture, the color. And also, this is something that I've done for years. I often write messages to my husband using asemic writing, which is, writing from the top to the bottom, or from the bottom to the top, or from the left to the right. But I write messages to my husband using asemic writing, which is a nonsensical writing, but it also reflects the mark making that you've developed over the years. I write messages to my husband, knowing that when the painting's finished, they'll be lost to posterity. But that's just one of those things that I do.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I'm going through these kind of quickly. There's a lot of work on display in the gallery, so it hopefully everyone can come out and see the show in person if possible, to really kind of study each of these works, because there are I believe 68 in the gallery.
68, yes.
And varying sizes. And I want to talk, we talked a little bit about the encaustics, but you also do these monotypes where you're using ink as well as wax. Can you tell me the process of creating those?
Yes, in the video, you may have seen this big box to my right. It's called a Paula Roland Hot Box, and Paula Roland is a very well-known, internationally known artist. And she developed a hot box which maintains an even temperature. The highest it'll go is 200 degrees, because any higher than that is really not good for wax. But it'll go anywhere from 165 to 200 degrees, and you can adjust it. It has an adjuster on it. So what I do is I take encaustic circles or encaustic rectangles. That's the way that the paint comes. You may have seen some of that when I was demonstrating in the video. And I draw on the Paula Roland hot plate. And I also use a variety of tools, which I'll show you after the video is over, but I use a variety of tools to move that paint around. And as soon as I get it to where I feel like it's working, I take a piece of handmade Japanese paper, lay it down on top of the hot box, get a burnishing tool and burnish it, lift it back off and set it aside. sometimes I like it the way it looks there. Sometimes I feel like it needs a little bit more. And when it does, I use Indigo Inks. Now, Indigo Inks are not alcohol. They're not stain inks. They're not like alcohol ink or acrylic ink, which are all good, but these are pure pigments. So it's Dr. P.H. Martin inks. And so I dress the piece with the inks and let it dry, and then it's completed.
And you did that for this one here, the Walk, Don't Run piece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's mostly encaustic, but it does have some ink in it.
Now, I had so much fun looking at all the titles of your pieces. Some of them are named after movies and songs. That was really fun. How are the inspirations? Are these pieces inspired by the songs or movies? And how do you kind of incorporate them in?
Well, they are. The Golden Slumbers, of course, everybody's probably familiar with that tune. And as soon as I finished this, it was so almost monochromatic, even though it's got the aquas in it. The golden just kind of jumped out at me. So that was titled pretty quickly. The Ground Control to Major Tom. This painting named itself. That lyric is taken from the classic David Bowie tune, Space Odyssey. And as soon as I finished it, I had the feeling of, I don't know if people are familiar with that story or not, but Major Tom goes out in space and unfortunately has an unhappy ending. He floats away, but there's a moment where he is out in space and enjoying all the beauty that's around him. And for some reason, this painting, it named itself. When it was over, I went Ground Control to Major Tom. So wow. Not very sophisticated, but that's the story.
Well, I mean, I enjoyed all the references that I could, pick out. So it was a lot of fun, just the titles alone. So
yeah, Obladi is a lot of fun. Obladi, Oblada. And of course, this painting also named itself House of the Rising Sun. As soon as I was through with it, I don't know why. Sometimes they just come to me. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer.
Yeah. That's fun. If anybody has any questions or anything, you can type them into the chat. You kind of answered one of the biggest ones that I had, which was about the titles. I really was curious about that.
Yeah.
Grace, did you have any questions?
I do. So having seen different chapters of your work for the last 17 or so years, so we saw some of that today, the glass work that you've done, the graphite pencil, which is, I was listening to you describe the process for that, the fine lines, and looking at how much depth and clarity that gives that work. It's pretty amazing to see the range of value you can get with that you might not get with another process. But looking at that and then encaustic, it seems like you gravitate towards very process-oriented art making. Like a fine craftsman. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I had never really thought about it that way, but I think because my first run through on any painting is never enough. And as I said, I wasn't kidding. Some of these 3x5s, that particular painting right there, the one in the middle, We Are the World, that particular painting has 15 layers. It has 15 different paintings under it. Yeah. And I have a picture of every one of them. So the first run through, it's almost like it's a given. It's like, okay, this is where it is, and I let go of it. But I never really thought about myself as being process oriented until you said that, Grace, but I guess that I am. I really had never thought about that. I sort of thought I was free forming it, but you're absolutely right. So this is kind of an eye-opening discussion for me as well.
Well, it's funny because I've always known you as very positive and kind and outgoing and creative, but you've got to be also extremely patient or just meditative, because when you're process oriented, you are in that moment from moment to moment. Of course, Angie and I work with a number of craftspeople, and it's a different way of being. I wish I were more patient. I am not patient enough. But I really admire that. How long does it take you to create an encaustic painting? Is there an average or how long do you think?
Probably, I'll finish one in a couple of days, sometimes maybe a week, and then go back in on it 2 or 3 weeks later and completely change it up. So when you see those paintings, I'm not comparing myself to that, but when you see paintings in art history that say they were done from 1898 to 1905, it's because they worked on it and reworked it and reworked it.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a blessing, and sometimes you think, why did I not leave that alone?
Mhm.
You know, it was better before. But most times it works out for the better. You sometimes you think you're finished, and you go down later and you think, no, I wasn't really finished with this.
Mhm.
And luckily, the mediums that I work in, I have the opportunity to change them. And I will tell you that even though it's a totally different process, the drawings that I do, and when I'm using the torch with the encaustic, it's the same feeling. And you were right when you said meditative.
Mhm.
It's just I don't usually hurt myself with the graphite, but sometimes I burn myself with the torch. Not often.
Destroys the meditation a little bit.
Yes.
So I have to tell you, the glass piece that you showed early on, this is just a trivia, but that piece in the middle that won a 3rd place internationally,
Mhm.
one of the first pieces I bought here was one of your wall glass pieces
Mhm.
with a similar composition to that. I love it. So
Well, thank you. Yeah. So that was actually the daughter of this painting.
awesome.
Grace,
That's
I'll
neat
tell
to
you, I
know.
recognized that. As soon as I saw it, I thought, I recognize that. Looks so similar to a piece that Grace purchased. Like that's how memorable it was. I mean, that was really
Yeah.
so funny.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
That was a long time ago.
I really love the different layers, how you said there's almost a paint, 15 different paintings underneath the
Mhm.
paint. I think that's a
Mhm.
really interesting idea. And like you said, that the process, and sometimes, you can't go back. Once it's done, it's done. So,
Right.
and really just kind of, you have to, especially with these mediums that you work with, you have to go with sometimes what the materials are telling you to do. I feel like that's, like you said, you're intuitive and
Right.
that's interesting thing. Well, do we have any other questions perhaps, or
I just had one more. So Terrie, you're one of the most non-objective of the abstract artists that we exhibit. And,
Mhm.
Is it difficult to stay away from representational imagery when you're creating these compositions?
Well, one of my professors taught me 2 good lessons. His name was Gadsden. He was my major professor, and I loved that man. But he told me, he recognized early on that even though I was, taking all the life drawing classes and painting classes and still live classes, that I was probably going to, my work showed more of a bent toward more abstraction or non-objectivity. And he told me early on that for my purposes, if he were me, if I started seeing something in the work, to quit seeing it, to go paint over it. He said, I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just suggesting. He said, because you're trying to be, you're painting non-objectively. And when things start appearing in your work, now that doesn't mean that I always do that. Sometimes if something creeps through, like the painting that was in the gift shop that had the heart in it,
Mhm.
I let those things come about. I don't, but another time he was talking to me and I was painting. This was so funny. I remember it like it was yesterday, and it's 30 or 40 years ago. I was painting and I lifted my brush away too quickly, and some of the paint started dripping down the painting. And I started to reach out, and he just touched my elbow and he said, "What is." And I still have that painting today, partly because of him and partly because it's one of my husband's favorite paintings. But sometimes you just have to let the painting speak to you. You have to let things happen the way they're going to happen. And later on, if you decide you don't like it, that's fine. But sometimes let things evolve, let them materialize, let them speak to you.
Fantastic.
we have one more question from Beth Appleton saying, it was fascinating to see your work, and your range of work is amazing, but is there another medium you wish to explore in the future?
I thought I'd love to do sculpture, but my hands just aren't strong enough. I really thought, listen to a James Taylor tune, making a clay pot, sitting on our back deck, that would be my, real joy. But I found out that my hands aren't strong enough to do that for some reason. I'm not sure why. But right now, I really just want to pursue the encaustic and the wax and the glazed graphite. I'm really enjoying that. And I think I learn something new every day. That's not a cliche. It's an absolute truth. So the answer would be yes, there was a point where I did, but now I think I'm satisfied with going further. There's so many different things you can do with encaustic, and there's so many different things you can do with a drawing. I want to explore those to the fullest.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Well,
Beth.
Mary Sterner Lawson says, you know, she has a piece of Terrie's that's one of a 3-person group, and maybe we can have you show that to us at the end when we stop the screen share. That would be great. We'd love to see that. I just want to say thank you, Terrie, for spending the time with us and telling us all about your process and sharing your thoughts, because it's really insightful to be able to hear directly from the artists. That's one of the greatest things about working here, is I get to talk with the artists whose work is on display. Grace, do you want to tell us what's coming up next at Gadsden Arts?
Yeah, and I want to echo that, Terrie. This goes to you and to all of the artists who bring us great exhibitions. We know an enormous amount of time and energy goes into mounting an exhibition with us and bringing that work and letting us share it with the larger community. So we appreciate you for going to great lengths to bring us 68 pieces of work. And I share your congratulations to Angie for her installation. It really feels like an installation in some ways, as well as an exhibition of those separate pieces. But we appreciate all of our artists for helping us do what we do.
We appreciate the opportunity. Believe me, we love working with this great staff. We love the museum. So thank you all so very much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we do have some great things coming up. Before I mention these events, Angie, we have an Art in Gadsden artist deadline. I know we have many artists on this program, and that is coming up April 20.
May 13th.
May 13th. Sorry, I probably just gave some artists a heart attack, but May 13th, Art in Gadsden entry deadline. Please enter. That is always such a strong show. Again, thanks to all of you. We have another Art Talk Live coming up this month with Tom Friedman, and that is about the FSA photographers from the 1930s who are part of our Masters of American Photography show. So those were the Farm Security Administration photographers who went out and photographed life in very depressed parts of our country in the 1930s. It'll be a great presentation by Tom. Masters of American Photography continues through June 25th. And then just to highlight a couple of other key exhibitions, the major ones that we have coming up, Art in Gadsden is entering its 34th year. 34 years. And that'll open on July 22nd. We're very excited about that. And then we have a fun exhibition this fall for our major exhibition called Marvelocity. It's the work of top Marvel Comics illustrator Alex Ross. His drawings and paintings, and includes his childhood work and some sculpture. And we'll develop a lot of fun programs and events to go with that coming this fall. So, and much more, but I wanted to highlight those things. And remember too, if you ever want to bring a group of people for a guided visit with any of our staff or docents, we love to have you. There's no charge for the guided experience. For members, there's no charge at all. For non-members, it's just admission, but we love to guide any group of 4 or more. And when you share some background on the artist or the artwork and you have an interactive conversation, people see so much more and take so much more home with them. So please reach out to me if you'd like to schedule a visit for a group.